Are you engaging people to get treatment, or are you enabling people to be homeless?
Welcome to Restorations. I'm Caitlyn McKenney, and I'm excited to share with you a new report out of Discovery Institute, authored by Senior Fellow Robert Marbett and myself. A new approach to homelessness in Seattle presents data on homelessness and policy recommendations informed by that data. Dr. Marbett joined me in the studio to help unpack this policy report for you. But before we get to that interview, let me share just an overview of what we found and what we think needs to change in Seattle. Nationwide, homelessness increased by 12% last year to the highest number on record. If that growth rate stays the same, homelessness will double in the next 5 to 6 years. So things are bad at a national level, but in King County, the situation is even worse. Unsheltered homelessness increased by 23% in King County. And if nothing changes, the number will double from 10,000 individuals to 20,000 experiencing unsheltered homelessness in less than 3 years. Let me say that again just to be very clear. Nationwide, doubling in less than 6 years. In King County, doubling in less than 3. This should be a wake-up call for leaders in King County and in Seattle. So why? Why are we facing such a tragic crisis of unsheltered homelessness here? The data points to 2 significant reasons. The first is a dramatic change in the distribution of funding in the last decade or so. Seattle moved away from funding emergency and transitional housing beds and went all in on permanent supportive housing. Instead of a balanced continuum of care that moves from emergency to transitional to permanent housing, Seattle is spending hundreds of millions of dollars on fully subsidized housing units with no requirements for treatment or job training for the people that live in them. The second piece of data that explains why the crisis is particularly bad in King County is that half of the people experiencing homelessness here first began experiencing homelessness outside of King County. We surveyed clients in homelessness programs in Seattle and found that 49.7% first started experiencing homelessness in a different county, in a different state, or even in a different country. So what got Seattle here? Putting the vast majority of our resources into permanent supportive housing, halting any requirement of treatment in that housing, and taking a one-size-fits-all approach to people on our streets no matter where they came from or why they ended up here. In the report, we give Seattle's leaders 3 immediate action steps in response to the policies that got us here. The first is to allocate all unrestricted funding towards treatment and recovery programs. The second is to redirect funding towards an emergency response and start to rebalance that continuum of care. And the third is to create 2 clinical tracks that put people in the best environment for their recovery. And that means prioritizing family reunification for people who began experiencing homelessness outside of King County and should get treatment and services back home where their support network is. Here's Dr. Robert Marbett, Senior Fellow and former Director of the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, to discuss these recommendations. Welcome, Robert. It's good to have you back on the show. Let's just dive in and start talking about this study that we did. We did a survey of guests in homelessness service programs in Seattle, and the key takeaway that we found was that the vast majority of people experiencing homelessness in Seattle were not born here, they did not go to high school here, they don't have family here, and about half of them first started experiencing homelessness outside of the area, outside of Seattle or King County. Can you speak a little bit to why you think that's happening?
Well, and I think there are 2 whys. There's why is that happening and why is that important?
Yes.
So which one do you want? Where do you want to go?
Let's start with why. Why is that happening? Have you seen this? You've done similar work in cities across the U.S. Is it just Seattle that's seeing this or are there other cities?
It's happening in Seattle for two reasons. One is your coastal areas, that's a natural tendency. The weather, you get away from the harshness. Water, oceans, rivers moderate temperature and moderate weather conditions. And so one is you're on the West Coast. So anybody on the West Coast gets that. But Seattle really got it worse, like way worse than even a San Diego, a Los Angeles, a Santa Barbara. And the reason why you got it is because the word on the street all across America is come to Seattle and everything's free. Come to Seattle and we'll take care of you. We'll give you free stuff. Don't come to nobody. There's not a message that says come to Seattle and get treatment and recovery. That is not anything anybody hears. And so the idea is both the combination of the good weather, good climate combined with the free stuff. So Seattle became just really disproportionately problematic in this category.
Half of the people in Seattle that are homeless right now, experiencing homelessness, first started experiencing homelessness outside of the area. We're not just talking about a little bit north, a little bit south of here. We're talking about from around the country and even around the world. Now we are faced with how do we help these people? One of the initial pushback that some people might give when they hear this is, wait a second, I heard in 2018, 2020, the numbers cited in Seattle from the point in time count is that about 80% of people experiencing homelessness are from here. They're not from out of town. What would we say to that? Why is that not actually a helpful statistic?
And it's actually quite simple. They don't ask the question right. And with point in time, literally the question is, where were you the night before you started experiencing homelessness? So if I'm at the Greyhound station coming in to move to Seattle, or I'm hitchhiking in, coming in a van, and the night before I get to where I'm interviewed, the night before I go to where I'm eating or sleeping or resting, wherever, and you is in Seattle because it's within 24 hours. And so it disproportionately says everybody's homegrown, and they're not. Real homegrownness is not where were you the night before you got to Seattle, which might be the Greyhound station in Seattle. It is, where did you go to high school? Do you have family living or dead here? Did you have a job here 2 years ago? Do you have a rental agreement, a housing agreement, a utility? Were you born here? That's really where you're from. And instead, the way HUD point in time asks is the night before, where were you? And so it gives you a really bad data point. And if you start with bad data, you're going to end up with bad solutions.
Okay, so have that in mind if you're listening to this, watching this, when you hear that 80% number, that's not a fair estimate of who's actually homegrown here.
It's totally distorted,
Yeah.
and it's so bad it gets you going to the wrong solution. That's how bad it is.
Yeah.
And here's why it's bad for the let's do both why it's bad for the community and why it's bad for the person. It's bad for the person because your chance of recovery in not your home environment is significantly worse. In simple terms, you have a better chance to get out of homelessness by being where your home is. There's one caveat. I would say any domestic violence, sexual violence, any of that, I exclude that would not be good to go back home. But for everybody else, your better chances to recovery with your family, your friends, your systems you understand. And that clinical data, that knowledge, you've done some good research on it, is even SAMHSA brings this up, that puts it up in their homepage of how important it is to be with your family. And what a lot of people will say, oh, well, their family's broken up and they're not doing well and they're dysfunctional and they're not talking to each other. That's exactly why you need to go there. That's why the psychiatrist, the psychologist said that's part of the brokenness. And so you have to work that, not run from it, work it, and you work that, and that's how you get your recovery. And so it's very important to understand at a clinical, psychiatric, psychological level, your best chance of recovery is where real home is, not a place you don't know, that you don't have connectivity and such. Now, why is that bad for the community? Right now, you have out-of-towners taking away resources from in-town people, because in-town people are where you should focus on, because that's where their chance of recovery is. And that's also, in many ways, philosophically, whether you're conservative or liberal, you want to take care of your people who are from that tax-paying district. So if taxes are in a geography area, helping this geography, those are the people you should help. That's basic concept of tax fairness over the years. And so if you bring a lot of people and attract a lot of people from out of town, and they start to pull and push and take away resources that you need for the in-town people who are really the best chance of recovery to help.
So let's keep talking about that, because this is why the data is important, right? So the data says vast majority of people experiencing homelessness in Seattle, not born here, didn't go to high school here, don't have family here. And what we're suggesting, our first kind of immediate action step recommendation in our policy proposal, is don't send everyone down the same path. Don't have a one-size-fits-all solution. And so for those who have a long-standing support network, family here in the area, prioritize long-term, robust services, get them into treatment. They have the best chance at recovery here. And for those who do not have that long-standing support network and connection here, prioritize emergency services for them and then help them get connected with their family or with people to support them in recovery where they have the highest chance at that. I'm going to guess that some people, when they hear that as a policy proposal, it grates against their sense of compassion or justice, because we feel like, why would we not help everyone the same way who's here? And what I think I hear you're saying, and it's correct, is that that's not loving or compassionate.
It's actually not compassionate. Yeah. You're giving the person less chance of recovery, and you're not putting them in the best chance of recovery, and you're not putting them in a family reunification, and it can be family or friends. It could be, the whole system. It's what you're familiar with. It's what you're connected to. And so the best thing you can do compassionately is put everybody where they are with the best treatment program to give them the highest chance of recovery. Unless your goal is, I just want to keep you in homeless. Yeah. And that's a rhetorical statement, but Seattle historically has been a community that seems to say, let's keep you in homeless. Back when you had the Jungle 1 and Jungle 2 and did that, there was nothing about treatment, nothing about recovery, nothing about truly getting you out of homelessness. It was all about, how do we take care of you now that you're homeless and you're experiencing homelessness? That's not compassionate. That's like saying, stay right there. Yeah. Let's don't get you out of treatment, and we'll bring you goodies, we'll bring you clothes, we'll bring you sleeping bags, camping equipment, and food, and just stay right there. That's not compassionate. Yeah. That's saying stay in homelessness. Even
when we know clinically what's going to help you the best and where you're going to have the highest chance at recovery. But no, we reject that and stay there and treat everyone the exact same way.
And that's why data is so important. Yeah. And that's why you got to understand the point-in-time data, which is designed to talk about housing. It's not designed as a clinical feature. It's not a clinical instrument. Mm-hmm. And so it gives you bad data, and so you start down the wrong course right away. And so a lot of people are going to say, our data's not right. So I would argue, let's go do it together. Let's go do another research. Let's do it with the bigger sample. Let's do, even though our sample size statistically significant. You want to try another group? Let's go do it. I am so
absolutely.
confident after we saw how many people are out of town. I think you can take any piece of anywhere around Seattle or King County and do this. So if you don't like the data, let's go out and do it together. Let's go to another group. Let's take another sample. Let's go to another feeding area. Let's go to another part of town. I guarantee you, not only is it going to show the same thing, there are parts of this community I actually think will be significantly more out of town.
Yeah.
I think the more chronic our group is, the more out of town they will be. And there's a lot of some reason why that. The biggest point is the other real data that's hidden in here is, where did you become homeless, here or somewhere else, and then did you come here? You have a huge number of people who started experiencing homelessness somewhere else and then moved here, which gets you into, are you engaging people to get treatment, or are you enabling people to be homeless?
That's
And
a great distinction.
the policies here seem to be about enablement and stay right there rather than let's engage you and get out of homelessness.
Yeah.
And let's talk about clinical tracks. Some people think it's uncompassionate. If we had people go to the ER, would it be compassionate to say we're going to give you an antibiotic for a heart attack, an antibiotic for a stroke, an antibiotic for a viral pneumonia? Now, if you had a bacterial pneumonia, an antibiotic is the right thing. But if you're having a heart attack, saying, I'm going to treat you the same way, it would be not compassionate to give an antibiotic. You want to shock the heart back if the heart is stopped. If you're having a stroke, we want to unclog the cloggage, the blockage. If you give an antibiotic, you're not going to do that. So if we think of things sort of comparing them in medical terms, it'd be very not compassionate. It'd be medical malpractice to treat everybody the same way. Yeah. But somehow in the world of homeless, we want to make this an egalitarian and we want to treat everybody alike. This is a clinical issue. This is a medical issue, often medically above the neck. So why don't we treat it that way? But that's not the way we're treating it.
Absolutely. And so what we're proposing is start being informed by this data and by this truth about where people are most likely to have a successful recovery and restoration to their fullest potential, which is what we want to see, by prioritizing the city's limited resources for those with a long-standing connection here. And also, it can be both things. It can be a compassionate response, it is, and also a pragmatic and realistic and common sense response, right? We're seeing the city struggle to navigate the budget and the finances and the resources needed to treat now 10,000 people. They say 10,000 people unsheltered in King County. That's a lot of resources. And so how do we effectively and efficiently prioritize those?
And if Seattle and King County had taken this approach 10 years ago, based off the math, both looking at our data and point-in-time data reinforces this too, that you would have half the people here that we'd have. So think about that. That means you'd have, take our current resources, pretend like we get no more resources. That means you'd have twice as many resources to apply to help each individual person or family that was from here. And you would have, think about it, we wouldn't need more money. You'd have twice as much money to help the correct group, the number that would be most likely to recover. And you can do that. And so we don't have a dilution of resources for the homegrown, and you take your out-of-towners and put them in their best position of recovery. So for one group would get the best position of recovery, and the other group would get twice the amount of financial resources without changing anything in the budget.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. It's a win. It's a win-win for everyone. Yeah. Have you seen this type of strategy work effectively in other cities?
Oh, absolutely. San Antonio has had, you have to live within one of the 7 counties that touch Bexar County, or Bexar County or the 6 counties that touch Bexar County. So basically it's a 50-mile radius. And we by far have put more people into treatment and recovery with 1 year sustainability than any other community I know. And this is a large city. Larger than Seattle, larger than King County, Bexar County is. It is a treatment-oriented process. It's not a politics. It's not an ideology. Everything is driven by clinical data, and it changes how you do this. I get very frustrated that some of the communities I go to seem to be more ideologically, politically driven or philosophically driven rather than think of this as a medical type of situation. And you want to do a medical response that's based off of data that's customized to you. You don't want to treat a broken arm the same way you treat a stroke or a heart attack, the way you'd treat a bacterial infection. They're different, so you have to treat them differently. But we're trying to treat all the cohorts the same way with the same treatment, with one only treatment, rather than having a multitude of thoughtful, meaningful treatments. We're saying we're going to limit it to one treatment, and that's what Seattle's done. And the other is how you all have drawn people here. Everybody knows if you come to Seattle, historically, we'll give you a bunch of free stuff. We're not going to encourage you into treatment. We're not going to have participation requirements. You just get to come here and you don't have to worry about anything. And we'll just give you free stuff. So why wouldn't the homelessness community start to be an epicenter? And remind everybody, you're basically the third worst community in America.
Yeah.
I mean, this is not you're doing worse, you're doing bad. You're the third worst.
Of a nation that's already at its worst in terms of homelessness.
Yeah, you're the third worst of the worst homelessness-oriented country in the world. Yeah. And so this is not, you're doing it a little bad, you're doing it really bad. And the thing I guarantee you, and this is what the White House data, this is not my data or a conservative think tank data. The White House is saying it's now doubling every 5 to 6 years. And so if you think 10,000 is problematic, if Seattle and King County don't fundamentally make a change, you will now be 20,000 people in 5 years. Yeah. And I remember when Jungle One come along, and I thought, oh, nobody had ever seen anything like that in the country. And candidly, I talked to people in Seattle, they say, oh, I remember the good old days where we just had Jungle One. And then you went to Jungle Two, and then you went to 2 others, and then you had 4 of the biggest encampments in the world. I mean, outside of Calcutta, that's the only place that had worse. So we're comparing ourselves to a third or fourth world city country, and that's where Seattle's gotten.
It's tragic. And you say that, it shouldn't be political or ideological, but at the same time, it requires politics and political will and motion to put something in place that could effectively address this. How would you encourage people? I think...
As a former elected official in the city of San Antonio, and I was mayor pro tem in a community, and I was a city council, the largest city council district. And in our community, we had 9 Democrats on city council, 1 independent, 1 conservative. So I was in the minority the whole time, but we did fine. And what we did was we had political ideology, but on many issues, we focused on common sense.
Yeah.
And so you can have a politician who uses common sense, or clinical in this case, and you will get to the right decision. You may get to it through different philosophies. One person might be saying, I'm doing this because I want to be the most efficient. Another might say, I want to be the most effective. But you get to the same place if you use common sense. Yeah. And candidly, up and down the West Coast, the lack of common sense to drive decision-making rather than ideology driving decision-making. That's why there's a reason why there are 3 or 4 places that have become the worst and are growing and continuing to be worse, because they're holding on to ideology rather than using common sense that's driven by clinical data.
That's encouraging to hear, because I think the majority of people that would listen to this or would hear this idea probably recognize themselves, whether they live in Seattle, they work here, they work with people experiencing homelessness here, that this is common sense and that it is true that the majority of people that they're working with or interacting with are not from here, and that we need a better approach to that.
The other takeaway is pre-2013, when the numbers were much lower than they were, and you had not as many out-of-towners here, you also had a very balanced, what's called a continuum of care. You had 1/3 in the emergency, almost exactly 1/3, 1/3 in transitional and 1/3 in long-term. And so you had people in emergency facilities, transitional housing, and long-term supportive services. And it was really evenly. So as you work through the system, you were working through a treatment program, and there was accountability and there were treatment requirements. And so when Seattle significantly moved away, it's really become out of balance. There's almost no transitional housing in the middle left. Relative to long-term, the emergency services is much less than it used to be. It's just a fraction. And so I know that's sort of a different deal, but it reinforced when you have so many out-of-towners and you don't have enough resources to take care of your in-town people, and then you start tweaking your services the wrong way, it exacerbates it. So those two things working in tandem have made things significantly worse for Seattle.
Yeah, and I'll show that graph as well, which shows services were balanced prior to the housing first shift and the shift in Seattle, and now there's a huge imbalance in the availability of different types of resources.
Let's get very agnostic and let's throw any political philosophy or you're pro or against this type of this thing or another, and go back to 2012 in Seattle. Look at your total numbers in 2012. Look at the balance of treatment, emergency, transitional, and long-term, and look that you had way less out-of-town people than you had. So if you just look at those things and how much your money you spent, way less, and you had way less homelessness.
Yeah.
So then you fast forward and you get your emergency services out of balance. We no longer have treatment requirements. Pre-2013, there were treatment requirements. And pre-2013, the focus was on treatment. And now the focus is on how do we make you happy in Seattle. And I am not surprised how bad it is.
Yeah.
I'm sort of surprised you're the third worst now. You're beating out, other than San Francisco and LA, you're beating out Portland now, you're beating out New York, you're beating out Chicago, you're beating out Atlanta, beating out Miami is the worst city. That is sort of surprising how bad you've come. But I'm not surprised how you got here.
Yeah. And it was a philosophical and ideological shift that got us here. And just earlier this year, we heard Dow Constantine, the executive of King County, reminding people that housing is the sole problem here and the only solution to homelessness. And I say reminding, I say that sarcastically because it was basically you're wrong if you think that there's any other thing going on here. And that's reflected in the chart that I'll show because we're pouring all of our resources into permanent supportive housing as the answer.
And that is so naive. Yeah. If you look at the largest study ever done, and by the way, a left-wing think tank, on the left, by the Cal Policy Lab, UCLA and UC Berkeley. You can't get, better left-wing credentials. 64,000 person study, and they looked at all the different types of cohorts of homeless, and on street-level homelessness, which is where your problem is, where that 10,000 number's coming from, and on street-level homelessness, 3/4 had untreated mental illness, 3/4 had a substance use disorder, often self-medicating. What was shocking in the study is over 50% in both categories said, my untreated mental illness and my substance abuse was my cause of becoming homeless.
Yeah.
That's my condition of homelessness drew out of the untreated mental illness and substance use. And so when I read that clip, I watched that clip 3 times and I was like,
the one from Dow Constantine.
Yeah. It was like a disconnect from gravity. Yeah. It was so like, it was that out-of-body experience because there was no connection to reality.
Yes.
When you look at the largest data set from a left-wing think tank says this, I don't know how you could say that, match that up and reconcile it.
People themselves. I mean, that data was self-reported. So it's people experiencing homelessness themselves saying this.
The 50% was self-report, and then the 3/4 was actually looking at their clinical files. And this is a study of 64,000. There's been no other study that big. The nearest biggest study is like 1,000, 2,000 after that. And so there was one study out there about 4,000, did a little different sort of structural artifact of their study. When you see those numbers that strong, that bold, why are you pretending like it's something else? Again, if you start with the wrong data, the wrong analysis, you're going to get to the wrong place. And that's what Seattle has done.
Yeah, and that's why we're hoping that this new data that we've collected, which corroborates existing data, points us in that correct direction to treat people compassionately, not all the same response and same approach, and excited to hopefully start pushing in the right direction here in Seattle. Thank you, Robert, for joining me.
Thanks for having me on. Really appreciate it.
I hope that conversation provided helpful insights into practical, tangible solutions for Seattle's homelessness crisis. And for other cities across the U.S. that are facing similar challenges, these policy proposals can be applied there too. So often we talk about the ways that policies aren't working and are failing to solve the problems in front of us. And as much as we should be holding leaders accountable for the outcomes of their policies, we also have to provide alternatives, solutions to homelessness at a citywide level that are common sense and can be put into action. You can find this policy report at fixhomelessness.org. Please share it with your elected officials and join us in advocating for a new approach to homelessness in Seattle. Thank you for watching this episode of Restorations, and don't forget to follow and subscribe so that you don't miss the next episode.